Stephen King's The Dark Tower, Book 1, The Gunslinger. Chapter 1, The Gunslinger, 1. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what looked like eternity in all directions. It was white and blinding and waterless and without features save for the faint, cloudy haze of the mountains which sketched themselves on the horizon, and the devil grass which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way, for once the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crust of alkali had been a highway. Coaches and buckets had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied. The gunslinger had been struck by a momentary dizziness, a kind of yawing sensation that made the entire world seem ephemeral, almost a thing that could be looked through. It passed, and like the world upon whose hide he walked, he moved on. He passed the miles stolidly, not hurrying, not loafing. A hide water bag was slung around his middle like a bloated sausage. It was almost full. He had progressed through the Kef over many years, and had reached perhaps the 5th level. Had he been a manny holy man, he might not even have been thirsty. He could have watched his own body dehydrate with clinical detached attention, watering its crevices and dark inner hollows only when his logic told him it must be done. He was not a manny, however, nor a follower of the man Jesus, and considered himself in no way holy. He was just an ordinary pilgrim, in other words, and all he could say with real certainty was that he was thirsty. And even so, he had no particular urge to drink. In a vague way, all of this pleased him. It was what the country required. It was a thirsty country, and he had in his long life been nothing if not adaptable. Below the water bag were his guns, carefully weighted to his hands. A plate had been added to each when they had come to him from his father, who had been lighter and not so tall. The 2 belts crisscrossed above his crotch. The holsters were oiled too deeply for even this Philistine sun to crack. The stocks of the guns were sandalwood, yellow and finely grained. Rawhide tie-downs held the holsters loosely to his thighs, and they swung a bit with his step. They had rubbed away the bluing of his jeans and thinned the cloth, in a pair of arcs that looked almost like smiles. The brass casings of the cartridges looped into the gun belts, heliographed in the sun. There were fewer now. The leather made subtle creaking noises. His shirt, the no color of rain or dust, was open at the throat, with a rawhide thong dangling loosely in hand-punched eyelets. His hat was gone. So was the horn he had once carried, gone for years, that horn, spilled from the hand of a dying friend, and he missed them both. He breasted a gently rising dune, although there was no sand here. The desert was hard pan, and even the harsh winds that blew when dark came raised only an aggravating, harsh dust like scouring powder, and saw the kicked remains of a tiny campfire on the lee side, the side the sun would quit earliest. Small signs like this, once more affirming the man in black's possible humanity, never failed to please him. His lips stretched in the pitted, flaked remains of his face. The grin was gruesome, painful. He squatted. His quarry had burned the devil grass, of course. It was the only thing out here that would burn. It burned with a greasy, flat light, and it burned slow. Border dwellers had told him that devils lived even in the flames. They burned it, but would not look into the light. They said the devils hypnotized, beckoned, would eventually draw the one who looked into the fires. And the next man foolish enough to look into the fire might see you. The burned grass was crisscrossed in the now familiar ideographic pattern, and crumpled to gray senselessness before the gunslinger's prodding hand. There was nothing in the remains but a charred scrap of bacon, which he ate thoughtfully. It had always been this way. The gunslinger had followed the man in black across the desert for 2 months now, across the endless, screamingly monotonous purgatorial wastes, and had yet to find spoor other than the hygienic, sterile ideographs of the man in black's campfires. He had found not a can, a bottle, or a water bag. The gunslinger had left 4 of those behind, like dead snakeskins. He hadn't found any dung. He assumed the man in black buried it. Perhaps the campfires were a message, spelled out one great letter at a time. "Keep your distance, partner," it might say, or "The end draweth nigh," or maybe even "Come and get me." It didn't matter what they said or didn't say. He had no interest in messages, if messages they were. What mattered was that these remains were as cold as all the others. Yet he had gained. He knew he was closer, but did not know how he knew. A kind of smell, perhaps. That didn't matter either. He would keep going until something changed, and if nothing changed, he would keep going anyway. There would be water if God willed it, the old-timers said. Water if God willed it, even in the desert. The gunslinger stood up, brushing his hands. No other trace. The wind, razor-sharp, had of course filed away even what scant tracks the hardpan might once have held. No man-scat, no cast-off trash, never a sign of where those things might have been buried. Nothing. Only these cold campfires along the ancient highway moving southeast and the relentless rangefinder in his own head. Although, of course, it was more than that. The pull southeast was more than just a sense of direction, was even more than magnetism. He sat down and allowed himself a short pull from the water bag. He thought of that momentary dizziness earlier in the day, that sense of being almost untethered from the world, and wondered what it might have meant. Why should that dizziness make him think of his horn and the last of his old friends, both lost so long ago at Jericho Hill? He still had the guns, his father's guns, and surely they were more important than horns, or even friends. Weren't they? The question was oddly troubling, but since there seemed to be no answer but the obvious one, he put it aside, possibly for later consideration. He scanned the desert and then looked up at the sun, which was now sliding into a far quadrant of the sky that was, disturbingly, not quite true west. He got up, removed his threadbare gloves from his belt, and began to pull devil grass for his own fire, which he laid over the ashes of the man in blacks. He found the irony, like his thirst, bitterly appealing. He did not take the flint and steel from his purse until the remains of the day were only fugitive heat in the ground beneath him and a sardonic orange line on the monochrome horizon. He sat with his gunner drawn across his lap and watched southeast patiently, looking towards the mountains, not hoping to see the thin straight line of smoke from a new campfire, not expecting to see an orange spark of flame, but watching anyway because watching was part of it, and it had its own bitter satisfaction. "You will not see what you do not look for, maggot," Court would have said. "Open the gobs the God gave you, will you not?" But there was nothing. He was close, but only relatively so. Not close enough to see smoke at dusk or the orange wink of a campfire. He laid the flint down, the steel rod, and struck his spark to the dry, shredded grass, muttering the old and powerful nonsense words as he did. "Spark a dark, where's my sire? Will I lay me? Will I stay me? Bless this camp with fire." It was strange how some of childhood's words and ways fell at the wayside and were left behind, while others clamped tight and rode for life, growing the heavier to carry as time passed. He lay down upwind of his little blazon, letting the dream smoke blow out towards the waste. The wind, except for occasional gyrating dust devils, was constant. Above, the stars were unwinking, also constant. Suns and worlds by the million. Dizzying constellations, cold fire in every primary hue. As he watched, the sky washed from violet to ebony. A meteor etched a brief, spectacular arc below Old Mother and winked out. The fire threw strange shadows as the devil grass burned its slow way down into new patterns. Not ideograms, but a straightforward crisscross, vaguely frightening in its own no-nonsense surety. He had laid his fuel in a pattern that was not artful but only workable. It spoke of blacks and whites. It spoke of a man who might straighten bad pictures in strange hotel rooms. The fire burned its steady, slow flame, and phantoms danced in its incandescent core. The gunslinger did not see. The two patterns, art and craft, were welded together as he slept. The wind moaned, a witch with cancer in her belly. Every now and then a perverse downdraft would make the smoke whirl and puff toward him, and he breathed some of it in. It built dreams the same way that a small irritant may build a pearl in an oyster. The gunslinger occasionally moaned with the wind. The stars were as indifferent to this as they were to wars, crucifixions, resurrections. This would also have pleased him. 2. He had come down off the last of the foothills leading the mule, whose eyes were already dead and bulging with the heat. He had passed the last town 3 weeks before, and since then there had been only the deserted coach track and an occasional huddle of border dwellers' sod dwellings. The huddles had degenerated into single dwellings, most inhabited by lepers or madmen. He found the madmen better company. One had given him a stainless steel silver compass and bade him give it to the man Jesus. The gunslinger took it gravely. If he saw him, he would turn over the compass. He did not expect that he would, but anything was possible. Once he saw a Tahin, this one a man with a raven's head, but the misbegotten thing fled at his hail, cawing what might have been words, what might even have been curses. 5 days had passed since the last hut, and he had begun to suspect there would be no more when he topped the last eroded hill and saw the familiar low-backed sod roof. The dweller, a surprisingly young man with a wild shock of strawberry hair that reached almost to his waist, was weeding a scrawny stand of corn with zealous abandon. The mule let out a wheezing grunt, and the dweller looked up, glaring blue eyes coming target center on the gunslinger in a moment. The dweller was unarmed, with no bolt nor bar the gunslinger could see. He raised both hands in curt salute to the stranger, and then bent to the corn again, humping up the row next to his hut with back bent, tossing devil-grass and an occasional stunted corn plant over his shoulder. His hair flopped and flew in the wind that now came directly from the desert, with nothing to break it. The gunslinger came down the hill slowly, leading the donkey on which his water-skins sloshed. He paused by the edge of the lifeless-looking corn patch, drew a drink from one of his skins to start the saliva, and spat into the arid soil. "Life for your crop." "Life for your own," the dweller answered, and stood up. His back popped audibly. He surveyed the gunslinger without fear. The little of his face visible between beard and hair seemed unmarked by the rot, and his eyes, while a bit wild, seemed sane. "Long days and pleasant nights, stranger." "And may you have twice the number." "Unlikely," the dweller replied, and voiced a curt laugh. "I don't have no but corn and beans," he said. "Corn's free, but you'll have to kick something in for the beans. A man brings them out once in a while. He don't stay long." The dweller laughed shortly. "Afraid of spirits. Afraid of the Birdman, too." "I saw him. The Birdman, I mean. He fled me." "Yar, he's lost his way. Claims to be looking for a place called Algul Ciento, only sometimes he calls it Blue Haven or Heaven. I can't make out which. Has thee heard of it?" The gunslinger shook his head. "Well, he don't bite and he don't bide, so fuck him. Is thee dead or alive?" "Alive," the gunslinger said. "You speak as the manny do." "I was with him a while, but that was no life for me. Too chummy they are, and always looking for holes in the world." This was true, the gunslinger reflected. The manny folk were great travelers. The two of them looked at each other in silence for a moment, and then the dweller put out his hand. "Brown is my name." The gunslinger shook and gave his own name. As he did so, a scrawny raven croaked from the low peak of the sod roof. The dweller gestured at it briefly. "That's Zoltan." At the sound of its name, the raven croaked again and flew across to Brown. It landed on the dweller's head and roosted, talons firmly twined in the wild thatch of hair. "Screw you!" Zoltan croaked brightly. "Screw you and the horse you rode in on." The gunslinger nodded amiably. "Beans, beans, the musical fruit," the raven recited, inspired. "The more you eat, the more you toot." "You teach him that?" "That's all he wants to learn, I guess," Brown said. "Tried to teach him the Lord's Prayer once." His eyes traveled out beyond the hut for a moment, toward the gritty, featureless hardpan. "Guess this ain't Lord's Prayer country." "You're a gunslinger, that right?" "Yes." He hunkered down and brought out his makings. Zoltan launched himself from Brown's head and landed, flittering, on the gunslinger's shoulder. "Thought your kind was gone. Then you see different, don't you?" "Did he come from in-world?" "Long ago," the gunslinger agreed. "Anything left there?" To this the gunslinger made no reply, but his face suggested this was a topic better not pursued. "After the other one, I guess." "Yes," the inevitable question followed. "How long since he passed by?" Brown shrugged. "I don't know. Time's funny out here. Distance and direction, too. More than 2 weeks, less than 2 months. The Bean Man's been twice since he passed. I'd guess 6 weeks. That's probably wrong. The more you eat, the more you toot, Zoltan said. Did he lay by? The gunslinger asked. Brown nodded. He stayed supper, same as you will, I guess. We passed the time. The gunslinger stood up and the bird flew back to the roof, squawking. He felt an odd, trembling eagerness. What did he talk about? Brown cocked an eyebrow at him. Not much. Did it ever rain, and when did I come here, and had I buried my wife? He asked was she of the Manny folk, and I said yar because it seemed like he already knew. I did most of the talking, which ain't usual. He paused, and the only sound was the stark wind. He's a sorcerer, ain't he? Among other things. Brown nodded slowly. I knew. He dropped a rabbit out of his sleeve, all gutted and ready for the pot. Are you? A sorcerer? He laughed. I'm just a man. You'll never catch him. I'll catch him. They looked at each other, a sudden depth of feeling between them, the dweller upon his dust-puffed dry ground, the gunslinger on the hard pan that shelved down to the desert. He reached for his flint. Here, Brown produced a sulphur-headed match and struck it with a grimed nail. The gunslinger pushed the tip of his smoke into the flame and drew. Thanks. You'll want to fill your skins, the dweller said, turning away. Spring's under the eaves and back. I'll start dinner. The gunslinger stepped gingerly over the rows of corn and went around back. The spring was at the bottom of a hand-dug well, lined with stones to keep the powdery earth from caving. As he descended the rickety ladder, the gunslinger reflected that the stones must represent 2 years' work easily, hauling, dragging, laying. The water was clear but slow-moving, and filling the skins was a long chore. While he was topping the second, Zoltan perched on the lip of the well. Screw you and the horse you rode in on, he advised. The gunslinger looked up, startled. The shaft was about 15 feet deep, easy enough for Brown to drop a rock on him, break his head, and steal everything on him. A crazy or a rotter wouldn't do it. Brown was neither. Yet he liked Brown, and so he pushed the thought out of his mind and got the rest of the water God had willed. Whatever else God willed was Kaw's business, not his. When he came through the hut's door and walked down the steps, the hovel proper was set below ground level, designed to catch and hold the coolest of the nights, Brown was poking ears of corn into the embers of a tiny fire with a crude hardwood spatula. 2 ragged plates had been set atop opposite ends of a dun blanket. Water for the beans was just beginning to bubble in a pot hung over the fire. I'll pay for the water, too. Brown did not look up. The water's a gift from God, and I think thee knows. Papa Doc brings the beans. The gunslinger grunted a laugh and sat down with his back against one rude wall, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. After a little, the smell of roasting corn came to his nose. There was a pebbly rattle as Brown dumped a paper of dry beans into the pot. An occasional tack, tack, tack as Zoltan walked restlessly on the roof. He was tired. He had been going 16, sometimes 18 hours a day between here and the horror that had occurred in Tull, the last village. And he had been afoot for the last 12 days. The mule was at the end of its endurance, only living because it was a habit. Once he had known a boy named Sheemy who'd had a mule. Sheemy was gone now. They were all gone now, and there was only the 2 of them, him and the man in black. He had heard rumor of other lands beyond this, green lands in a place called Midworld, but it was hard to believe. Out here, Greenland seemed like a child's fantasy. 2 weeks, Brown had said, or as many as 6. Didn't matter. There had been calendars in Tull, and they had remembered the man in black because of the old man he had healed on his way through. Just an old man dying of the weed. An old man of 35. And if Brown was right, he had closed a good deal of distance on the man in black since then. But the desert was next, and the desert would be hell. Tack, tack, tack. Lend me your wings, bird. I'll spread them and fly on the thermals. He slept.